8:43 on a Monday morning. Welcome back to KWIX-AM this morning. I'm Monte Shisler on the phone with U.S. Senator Roy Blunt, Republican from Missouri. He's going to be with us for the next 15 minutes or so. We'll take your phone calls, 263-2424, 1-800-892-2300 if you have a question or comment for the Senator. And first of all, Senator Blunt, thanks for taking the time today.
Hey, good to talk to you, Monte. How are things where you are?
You know what? The sun was out over the weekend. The rain had stopped. The floodwaters have started to recede, and looks like we're off to a great summer.
Well, there you go. It looks like maybe we are emerging from drought conditions now, officially for about the last handful of months everywhere in the state, and we'll see what happens. But the ag economy is a strong part of our economy. Our trade opportunities are great. And continues to be an incredible economic motivator in our state and for the country.
I say this kind of tongue-in-cheek, but then also there's a point to the question. You have been gracious to join us live from your office in Washington. Is this phone call being recorded by anybody in charge of the federal government?
I'm actually on my my cell phone, so you got to believe that somebody could be easily listening to this, and it's one of the things I think people haven't adapted to yet with all of the information that we actually willingly give up constantly. The GPS in your phone, the information that's goes through anytime you go on to a search engine. There's a lot of information out there about all of us that far exceeds what we believe to be out there. Now, on the topic you brought up, I think the problem there is not the law that allows the government to actually monitor traffic of individuals, but if you take advantage of that, if you use too much of it, if you get too much information without having a real reason to do it just in case you need it. That's why on these laws like the FISA law, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act law that I've been a supporter of, and the Patriot Act, I've also always been for a sunset provision so that we're required to look at this every once in a while and determine whether or not the government is using the law the way the law is intended or somehow has gone beyond. And the other thing I'd say about this, too, is when the government has all this information, it's almost like they have no information. It's so much information that my view is it doesn't do you nearly as much good as if you truly were selectively looking at the things that the government perhaps needs to look at to protect us rather than wants to hold on to just in case they ever need it.
I've only got you for a few minutes, and we could probably do days and days on this. A couple of quick topics. Again, we'll take your call, 263-2424, 1-800-892-2300. I happened to talk to a research professor at the University of Missouri at the end of the week who is on his way to China to work out a program between, our government, state and federal, the University of Missouri, and the Chinese government on farms and working on agriculture. And I said, should we be surprised that you're going all this way to do that? And he said, look at all the people they have to feed. This seems to be a big deal for not only our country, but back closer to home, the University of Missouri. I don't know all the details of what he's working on, and he promised to fill me in when he got back, but this seems like a big step for agriculture in Missouri.
Well, it's a big step for agriculture in our state. It's a big step for agriculture in the country. It's an area, again, we're very competitive. I spoke a couple of weeks ago at the University of Missouri graduation at the Ag School, and one of the things I pointed out there is that every estimate, Monte, is that in the next 40 years, world food needs are going to come close to doubling. Something, and everybody agrees, at least 70% more food will be needed because of two reasons. One is population growth. Two is that once people get better food, they don't want to go back to the bad food, and so. The idea that we'll almost double in 40 years, 70%, let's say we'll double in 60 years, that means that all of the research, all of the capacity to produce food that we have created in the last 10,000 years, we have to equal in the next 40 or 50 years. So just think about that. And then the amazing thing to me is I believe we'll do that. I think the American farmer, ag research, all of those things will actually allow us in the next 40 or 50 years to double world food production. And that probably means that more than double U.S. food production. And that creates great opportunities. The rivers, you mentioned the rivers and the flooding earlier. The rivers are a great opportunity for us where we live to get those products onto the Missouri River, onto the Mississippi River, into the Gulf of Mexico, either to Europe, Africa, or through the Panama Canal to Asia. I think that the food story plus the more American energy story have huge potential to drive our economy in positive ways, and we need to make the most of both of those things.
And what's amazing to me is this kind of is going on in our backyard. At the University of Missouri, here we are going halfway around the world to help the Chinese government with farming and agriculture. Big kudos to MU.
Well, exactly. Helping them with their agriculture, also figuring out what they want and how they want it and what they want it to look like when they get it on those store shelves is a good thing for American producers and American processors. Food and shelter are two things you've got to have, and we are the food producers of the world in significant ways. And that's only going to get better and better. Look at the acres of production we have in production now that we didn't have 20 years ago, and then even more importantly, look at the significantly greater amounts of crop that we produce on the same acre from just a few years ago, and you'll see what's happening in American agriculture. How quickly we can get a pig from the farrowing stall to the production line. It's something that just a few years ago people wouldn't have thought possible at all. So our pork producers, our beef producers, our poultry producers, our grain producers, our cotton growers. We grow almost everything in our state, row crop rise, except sugar beets, and we're in all of these agricultural spaces like very few states are.
We just came out of a flooding situation along the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, floodwater starting to recede. Still some issues in some areas, but for the folks here in mid-Missouri, brought back a nightmare of 20 years ago, the Great Flood of 1993. We're getting ready to mark that anniversary in a special broadcast July 3rd. As we look back 20 years and look at the flood and the damage it did, do you think Missouri has completely recovered from the flood of 93? And boy, it scared us again here last couple of weeks.
Well, the closest since 93 was the flood 2 years ago, the flood of 2011, and we were all reminded of how the river is still a challenge to us as well as an opportunity. I continue to be concerned that the priorities of managing the river at the federal level don't match where the money goes. The priorities are supposed to be flood control, navigation, drinking water, and down that list about three more spaces are environmental habitat. But if you look at where the money is spent, a whole lot of the money since 1993 has been spent in a way that would prioritize the things at the bottom of the list instead of the things at the top of the list. And I'm going to continue to challenge the Corps of Engineers and this administration, as I have others. Let's either change the priorities, let's have a straight-up debate about this and change the priorities, which I'm not for, or let's spend the money like the priorities of managing the river are the priorities, and of course flood control is supposed to be at the top of that list.
It seems that the small farmer, the small town in mid-Missouri is caught in the middle of a political debate when it comes to talking of floodwaters, and every time it rains, they just look over their shoulder and go, we hope it doesn't happen again. Will that ever change?
I hope it does. I think as we begin to appreciate our economic opportunities that relate to agriculture and the river, we should understand how big a thing this is for us. One of the things you have to do when you look at where you live, whether it's your state, your community, or the piece of land you happen to own or happen to farm or happen to have your house on, is what's the advantage of where I am? And, one of the advantages we have is unique access to the world as global trade increases, as agricultural trade increases. And one of the most cost-effective, efficient, competitive ways to get access to the world is better use of the water. Not only does it allow us to move more product and much cheaper, but it also eliminates that much use on the highways and other things that don't have the resilience that the river does. And so we've got to be looking at these things and insisting that the government do things that make sense, that there's a cost-benefit analysis, that silly rules from the EPA, like the water that comes out of the stormwater system, some of our communities have been told has to be of drinking water quality. None of the water that went in there was of drinking water quality. There's some reasonable expectation that the water doesn't get worse through the system, but there's really no reasonable expectation that it gets better. Comes into the system, goes into a stream or river somewhere, nobody's going to drink it. It doesn't need to be at drinking water standards that your community has to pay for on the back of everybody's water bill. So we've got to have a government that makes as much sense as the American people have to make, spending their own money and making their own decisions. And I'm going to continue to do everything I can to push back on these regulations that don't make sense and fight for policies that make sense for private sector jobs and economic opportunity for the people that should have that at the top of their priority list, and that should be every American.
It is 8:55 on the phone with U.S. Senator Roy Blunt as part of KWIX-AM this morning. Senator, in the final couple of minutes, Benghazi, IRS, the phone tapping issue, the record sharing issue, the investigation dealing with sexual assault in the military and who should prosecute those cases. It seems like you've got your hands full, along with your colleagues in Washington, with scandal. When is that going to be set aside to where you can move forward rather than continually look backward?
Well, I think you have to have enough looking backward that you know how to move forward. The IRS scandal is the one that I think the American people are going to remember the longest and have the most concern about, because they know how government regulators, particularly the IRS, can impact them. The discussion of the IRS playing a greater role in enforcing the new health care law about insurance. We should be very concerned about that. An IRS that can't handle the job they already have, how do we give them another job? I had a piece, an editorial piece last week where the IRS decided they were going to audit more than 2/3 of every family in America that took advantage of the adoption tax credit. You've got an IRS here that is truly out of control, and I don't believe that happened in some remote office somewhere. I think it's something that we need to be concerned about. Benghazi, I was on the Intelligence Committee for a long time. Benghazi was a tragedy from the very start, and clearly the administration wasn't truthful from the very start. And we do have our hands full right now. But I think, frankly, this diversion into telephone records is probably helpful to the administration, because it draws attention from the IRS and other things that people at the end of the day are probably more concerned about if it was being talked about.
In the final 60 seconds we have, and I know people in business deal with the IRS and taxes all year long, with corporate taxes and filings and the self-employed and things like that. But for John Doe public, come next April 15th, are we going to remember this past year and what has happened? And are people going to be a little leery throwing that tax return in the mail April 15th?
Well, I don't think we have much choice about that. And I think what's happened here is when people no longer respect the process, compliance becomes a problem. Their attitude about keeping records when the IRS says, I can't remember, I didn't do anything wrong, but I don't want to talk about it, that sets a standard that begins to erode confidence in the greatest voluntary tax collection system in the history of Earth, where the American people, unlike other countries, year after year, do what they believe the law requires. They report things fairly. And I think you're going to see a diminishing of fair reporting as people have less and less appreciation for the way the government conducts itself.
Senator Roy Blunt, as always, we appreciate your time. We'll do this on a regular basis, but a lot to talk to. We could sit for hours, I'm sure, and talk about each topic, but to do it in 15 minutes, greatly appreciate your time and your insight, and we'll look forward to speaking with you again.
Well, Monte, always good to be with you, and look forward to talking to you soon.
That is U.S. Senator Roy Blunt. He joins us from his office in Washington, D.C. today on KWIX-AM This Morning.